Number 1. This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone since our parents had gone out to a Halloween party. They had given us the task of handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. This bummed me and my brother out because we had made our own plan to go trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us that we were too old to be still trick-or-treating, and that we would instead invite our friends over to the house and hang out there. My friends declined my invitation to come over because they still wanted to go trick-or-treating. So that left me alone with my little brother handing out candy. A lot of people stopped by our house, and by 10 o'clock, almost all the candy was gone. My brother and I decided that we'd eat the rest. We were sitting on the couch, watching a scary movie and stuffing ourselves with candy, when there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch, wondering who the hell would be knocking at the door this late. I assumed it was just some late-night trick-or-treaters. Even if that was the case, I had turned the porch light and the Halloween decorations off, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy or that we weren't home. So I assumed it was my parents. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole and saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood over his head, which made it difficult to see his face. The only detail of his face that I could spot was that he had a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way that this guy was a trick-or-treater, because he wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be trick-or-treating alone. His hands were stuffed in the front pockets of his hoodie, and he also looked very thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There was no way in hell I was gonna open the door. Still looking through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open the door and was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside. Definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. He was giving me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted at him. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile either. "Are you home alone in there?" the man asked, almost in a mocking voice. His voice was raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked me quietly, gripping his cell phone. The man let out a low grumble and said, "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole. His hands were still wedged tightly in his pocket, and he was still shaking a bit. I began to wonder if he was armed, and decided to take action, and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could. "Get the fuck away from my house, or I'll call the police," I shouted. His smile faded, and he bared his teeth. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded that he was probably some homeless crackhead. He had a look of fury plastered on his face. Fortunately, he left without trying to break in, probably because he knew I wasn't fucking around with him. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until I saw him completely off of our property. My brother and I breathed a sigh of relief and decided not to call the police. My brother and I were a bit paranoid after this, and watched TV until our parents came home. We didn't tell them about the man, since he hadn't really tried to harm us. Now when I think back to this, I wish we had called the police, because maybe we would have been able to prevent a murder. You see, the next day, we found out that the elderly woman who lived a few houses down from us had been brutally murdered. Her neighbor had found her lying on her front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in her chest and neck. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it, and we told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much with the information we had given them, since we hadn't seen many details of his face. They went on the hunt for the man, but never caught him. I blame myself for the poor old lady's murder, because I could have prevented it from happening just by calling the police. I think the most disturbing thing of all is the fact that he didn't even take anything from the old lady's house. Her house had been left untouched. He could have gone in and taken what he wanted, since her door was wide open. This means that he just wanted to kill. That was the only intention. He didn't want money or jewelry. He only had an urge to murder. So the creepy crackhead Halloween slasher, let's not meet. Number 2. At the time this happened, my sister was an infant, maybe 6 months old, which would make this roughly 18 years ago. My mother has been a waitress almost all her life, working at various restaurants, bars, and golf clubs. During this particular time, she worked for a bar. She had gotten off of work and she was having a small get-together of just a few people at her place to have a few drinks and play some cards. I was staying at my grandparents' for the weekend. She invited her manager, and at the time a very good friend, home with her to join her on the festivities. He got incredibly drunk. My mom can handle drunk people pretty well, but there was something off about him. While they were playing cards, he got this blank stare on his face, started making all kinds of weird grunting noises and howling. They were playing rummy, and the only thing he would put down was 666. He was freaking everyone out, and it was late, so she put him to bed on the couch, since he was in no condition to be driving home. She went to sleep with her boyfriend, and my little sister was sleeping in a crib next to their bed. Apparently, my mom and her boyfriend fooled around a little bit and ended up passing out. Shortly after she fell asleep, she could hear and feel her boyfriend and her manager roughhousing in the bed, thinking her manager was just drunk and wandering around the house. She kept telling them to stop or they'd wake up the baby. Her boyfriend didn't say a word, but seemingly got more and more upset as the play fighting ensued. They tumbled around in the dark before exiting the room, and her boyfriend slammed the door and yelled for her to lock it and get my sister somewhere safe. My mom locked the door and turned on the light. There was blood everywhere. My sister had blood spatter on her face. My mom was covered in blood and the bed was soaked in it. Not knowing what was going on, my mom took my sister, put her in the car seat, and hid her in the closet. My mom then got dressed and worked up the courage to try and find her injured boyfriend outside of the room. When my mother opened the door, there was her manager, slouched over about a foot in front of the door, almost like he was touching his toes, but couldn't quite reach them. He was wheezing, but not moving, not blinking, just slouched over. After realizing he wasn't going to move, she crept behind him and went to go and get her roommate to help her find her boyfriend. She came up to the bathroom first, where she banged and banged for whoever was in there to let her in. After about a few minutes of trying to convince them to open the door, my mom's boyfriend finally gave in and opened the door. My mom was able to see the extent of what she thought was a harmless fight. Her manager stabbed her boyfriend in the face. He cut his cheek open from an inch in front of his ear down to his mouth, where it was literally hanging on by a thread. You could see the entire inside of his mouth, gums, teeth, everything. They freaked out for a few minutes, but then decided it was time to go retrieve their roommates and my baby sister still sleeping away in a closet and go and try to call for help, because this was the mid-90s and no one had cell phones. My mother opened the door and her bangled bracelets made a bunch of noise, and the manager snapped out of his trance and in the most evil way jerked his head toward them and started to grunt. Her roommate and his girlfriend came out of the room, and the manager diverted his attention to the roommate's girlfriend. He chased her out of the apartment and down the street with a big-ass kitchen knife. My mom got my sister and ran like a bat out of hell to the neighbor's house. My mom's boyfriend ended up having almost 400 stitches put in his face, 100 put in his gums, and like 20 put in the tongue. And the police didn't find the manager until it was the next evening. He was found in the woods, lying on the ground. He didn't speak. He was just panting and staring at the sky. Number 3. It was around that time in my life where most kids my age would stop trick-or-treating, either because they thought it was lame or because their parents told them to stop. Me and my father had a similar conversation, and in the end, we decided that this trick-or-treat would be my final one. So when October 31st came, my dad helped me paint my face to look like a zombie. I figured that this costume should be simple, yet something I liked. So a zombie it was. I grabbed an empty pillowcase and headed out, with my parents telling me to be back around 11ish. Before you ask, yes, I was trick-or-treating by myself. I was able to convince my parents that I needed to get as much candy as I could, seeing as how this would be my last and final year trick-or-treating. So off I went, running from house to house, shoving candy into my pillowcase as fast as I could. So by the time it got dark, my pillowcase was about 3/4 filled, and I had no intention in slowing down. As I'm about to walk into a new neighborhood, A black van pulls up to the curb and it was a few feet away from me. The door opens and out of the darkness comes some guy in a hockey mask and a tattered jacket, wielding a machete. He turns his head towards me, probably just trying to creep me out. "Nice Jason costume," I say, trying to be friendly as I begin to walk past him. "Thanks, zombie. You want some candy? I've got bags of them," he says as he pulls out these little white sacks of candy. So I, being the idiot 14-year-old I was, opened my pillowcase and let him plop 2 or 3 sacks into it. "Make sure you eat them real soon. You'll love them," he snickered, which really sent a chill down my spine. He left as quietly as he came, but I just shrugged it off as I needed to finish trick-or-treating. I continued down the road, again going from house to house for candy. After about the 3rd or 4th house, I noticed something odd. It was the same black van from before. After every house I went to, the van would get closer and closer. At around what I could only guess was 10:30, I headed home with my sack full to the bursting. As I walked, the area behind me illuminated. I turned around expecting to see a car that would soon pass me. It was the van, and in the driver's seat was the same Jason Voorhees who gave me the candy. My heart stopped, and I broke into a mad dash back to my house, the van easily keeping up with me. I luckily able to lose him by running into the woods near my house. I exited the woods that led to the side of my house and looked for the fake rock that had the spare key to our house. After I got in, I put my candy on the kitchen table and somehow found a way to go to sleep. The next morning, when I woke up, my parents were sitting at the kitchen table, digging around through the bags of candy that Jason gave me. They started asking me where or who gave you these bags, which started to freak me out. I would later learn that the bags of candy were nothing more than just bags of prescription drugs. There was a ton of sleeping pills in them, and I finally understood his intentions. He was gonna follow me until I fell asleep, then do God knows what with me after he got me in that van. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure whether or not the machete that he had with him was fake or not. The police came up empty-handed, so I guess I'll never know his fate.